the most profound changes in the world have happened because of lawyers. Whether they decide to show up as a villain or a hero determines how they will impact the world. As y'all know, I've been covering this case in France with Gisele Pellicot. These are her lawyers. I did a video a few days ago about the closing statements and how awesome they were and how much I appreciate these lawyers. And I was fortunate enough to interview Simpson Tuegel, who is one of the biggest lawyers in the US, who is a victims' rights advocate, has represented some of the biggest cases that you know of. It's not just SA victims, she represents all kinds of victims. And I'm going to show you part of an interview I got to do with her a month ago. It was, if you want to see the whole video, go to my Patreon. It was like over 2 hours and it is incredible. I'm going to release other parts of it later. But this is about the Gisele Pellicot case and her telling me her thoughts on it, which I really appreciate. But yeah, Michelle has done this, got a settlement for the victims of the unaliving, the mass unaliving, USC, clergy cases, one against Hilton, especially USA Gymnastics. Yes, she was involved representing many of the victims. There were hundreds against this guy and all the enablers of this man, Larry Nassar. She's also represented Asia Evans, another athlete who was essayed by a doctor. This is a bobsled medalist. You can find her on TikTok. She wins law, Instagram under the same name. She is just a badass. Enjoy this interview. Let me know your thoughts and I will share more later. Lawyers can change the world and help victims get justice. This is the final week of the Gisele Pellicot case. They were suggesting sentencing this week, and then on December 20th, we will find out their decision. Also, I'm going to have Michelle back probably in January to look at how we move forward in this administration around these topics. So enjoy this part of the interview. I will release more later. And thank you, Michelle, for such an amazing, amazing interview and insight. Before we get into the impact on victims and all this stuff, how do you deal with this? How do you and all the people who are supporting a victim, like do your clients have family members? Do you encourage them? What do you encourage them to do before they go through something like this?
I mean, one of the things, one of our very early conversations is, of course, about getting clients into counseling and therapy. That can look different for each client. I always say trauma is not cookie cutter. So where everybody's at in their process, and if they're able to do EMDR, some clients are not at the place where that is a thing that they can withstand.
Yeah, no,
it's
actually, it's really bad to do that at the wrong time.
It can be extremely detrimental. And so
super dangerous.
I'm always really, I want them to consult a mental health professional because I'm not one, even though sometimes I feel like I am a counselor. And we have in our office a victim advocate who's gone through victim advocacy training, and she has a master's in psychology. I hired her because of that background. And we talk a lot about having trauma-informed communications with our clients, but we're not treatment providers. And as their advocates, we can't be and shouldn't be. But encouraging them to get that care, helping connect them with that care. In the United States, there are a lot of good free resources for survivors. Local rape crisis centers often offer free counseling and support groups. I have served with some of those groups in my own community because I think they're so important for survivors who can't immediately pay for a private counselor.
I actually meant to ask you about that. Is how does somebody come to you would people not come to you? I know that on your website, if they have, it says, oh, if you're afraid to reach out, there's a free consultation, and you have the email thing. Can you represent clients that can't afford you? Like how do you deal with that?
So we operate on what's called a contingent fee basis. So my clients don't pay me unless I get them a result. And then I'm paid a percentage of that result. And that is sort of the product and the reason why contingent fee lawyers exist is so people can hire attorneys when they could not afford one on an hourly basis. That's how most, and some people don't like it, personal injury lawyers operate in that context, because a lot of people couldn't come in and pay a $3,000 retainer to hire an attorney just to look into their case. And if I look into their case and I realize we can't get any further, that's on me and they don't owe me. So I have a lot of cases where we spend a lot of money because we also front the expenses to litigate our cases. And we only get those recovered if we get a result and win. And so I'm literally investing in myself, in cases and clients that I believe in and that I think we have some chance of getting them a result, so I don't drag them through what is a really hard process.
Mm-hmm.
And there's never a guarantee of a number or a result, but I don't drag them through that with no hope or evaluation on my end that I think we might get there. And
Mm-hmm.
so, taking care of the clients, taking care of ourselves. I don't think that we have it all figured out, and it is imperfect because people are imperfect, and we're always trying to improve our process and our communication and how we serve our clients better. But just being aware and having those conversations and realizing that every person is different, trying to connect those clients with what they need. And we're
Mm-hmm.
pretty creative. I think I probably, us and our staff are much more hands-on and interactive and trying to help connect clients with resources,
Mm-hmm.
because I always say to my clients, there is no case without you.
Mm-hmm.
I like, if you're not here and alive and able to participate in this case, none of it matters. Like, I can't
Mm-hmm.
do it without you. You are the most important person in this case. And I don't need them to be well, but I want them to have support.
Mm-hmm.
And I want them to have somebody besides me as the lawyer who can't be
Yeah.
everything for them, to
Yeah.
help support them and process and get them through the process. And I was talking to a group of social workers and counselors, I think it was last year, and they were like, what kind of treatment do you not recommend during the process? Like, is there treatment that's
Mm-hmm.
bad to get while you're going through litigation? And I was like, no, I want my clients to get whatever treatment is best for them, and we'll deal with it in the litigation,
Mm-hmm.
because it's more important that they're getting care than I think EMDR is good or bad for a case. What I think is good for the case is what's good for my client.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like just being human first,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think. And we try to just operate that way. I always tell my staff and our team, our client is the North Star. And if we're
Mm-hmm.
ever looking for what direction to go or what's the right call or how do we decide this, what's best for that client? And then we
Yeah.
try to let that be the guiding light. And it's sometimes hard to figure that out in the mess of what is complicated trauma, which is what
Yeah.
SA survivors go through, and a process that is re-victimizing. And
Yes, that's what I
yeah,
want to hit on next. I know we talked about that. I told you this is what I really wanted to talk about. I've heard some people call it the second. So on social media, I say
yeah,
you can say whatever, but I say grape because sometimes they censor me. But the second rape,
yeah,
which is, and like we've talked about before, Chanel Miller's book.
yeah.
It's honestly one of the best. It's a funny book too. It's a beautiful book.
She's
She's hilarious.
incredible.
She's an amazing writer, and I've never felt so seen or heard, and I never understood. I mean, the takeaway from that was like, oh my God, what the system did to her, what society did to her seems, I don't want to say more traumatizing, but it did seem more traumatizing than the act itself, because it was all these people
Yeah,
violating her, shaming her, all, and then the system, the judges, and all that stuff. So when you are taking on, and you talk about this on your website, and we've talked about this, but one of the things I wanted to get out of this
yeah,
interview was to, information is power, and the worst thing probably that could happen is for somebody to seek justice and not know what they're getting themselves into, which
yeah.
then could be further traumatize them, and then also they may quit, and then all. So what do you take into, like, you educate them on what they're going to face? Like, what does that look like when someone comes to you? What do you? I know it's contextual on the
Yeah,
client and their
it is
story.
different. It's different for each person. But one of the early conversations I try to have with survivors and talk through with them, and just be real with them, is that the process is going to be hard. And
Hmm.
by hard, what that means is that it will be invasive,
Hmm.
both at a personal level. Sometimes, I mean, as we've seen in the case going on in France, Giselle's case, at a
Yeah.
physical level. The information that will be sought from them in most sexual assault cases, and this isn't all, and I think it should. I often am arguing to protect my clients, to
Yeah.
protect their confidentiality, to protect their identity if that's what they choose.
Yeah.
But the information that is at play in a case of sexual assault, especially involving adults, often involves most of your medical records, a lot of your text communications, most of your social media posts. Um, it invades so many facets of our life that we just living daily life think of as fairly private, but for the sexual assault survivor, it gets under a microscope.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be. I don't agree with that, but I've seen it so many times that it is part of the process and preparing my clients for the things I like, disagree with, or whatever, but that I have seen happen a lot is part of my job. And
Yeah.
so walking them through what it looks like, what the first months of their case are going to look like, what information I'm going to need first.
Yeah.
What I need them to be doing, which is usually going to counseling, which a lot of people contact me and they may not have done that yet.
Yeah.
Because we are sometimes they're calling a lawyer to even understand what to do, what their rights are, who to report to. And so getting them support, counseling, some consistency with that is a first thing. I can't make them do it. I've had clients who I still work their case and we go through the case and we go through years where some clients are just not accessing the care that they need or they can't. And I'm trying to help them, but I can't go with them.
Yeah.
Although I have done that before. I probably shouldn't, but I've literally taken people or connected them with a counselor that I know or tried to just baby step them into what I know they need to get through the process. But communicating with them about, sometimes when I do education with lawyers, we talk about rape myths. And I also do some of that education with my own clients because just because you're a survivor doesn't mean you're not still suffering from the same biases that society communicates to us about what a perfect victim is or what consent means or what women are supposed to do. All of these myths that relate to sexuality and gender and consent that we have heard. And even if we think I don't accept that, it's at a deeper level. And so then
it's indoctrination,
the shame.
decades of it. It's in
Yeah.
here.
And
It's like I need
the
an
shame that you're
exorcism.
just like, I know that I shouldn't feel this or I shouldn't think this and I don't, but you've taken it in really deep. And the way that you're even thinking about your response to your own sexual violence is impacted by those myths. And a lot of my clients, I represent a lot of survivors who, when they come to me, what they are reporting to me is a completely separate instance of abuse than something that had happened earlier in their life. So they have been victimized multiple times.
Yeah.
The number of times survivors are afraid that I'm not going to believe them about sexual assault too, because they suffered some other abuse. I would say most of my clients, and that is no blame on clients. It is sadly there's statistics on it. I don't fully understand the reasons other than when we're vulnerable, it makes us more vulnerable. And it's not the victim's fault, but I do see people who are victimized multiple times in their life, particularly women and girls. And some of that relates to gender violence and discrimination and inequalities in our societies and the way that we view women and girls and the way that men behave towards women and girls. But, the number of times that the survivor has internalized that belief of someone's not going to believe me, or that first one wasn't assault because this couldn't happen twice. Educating them on some of the myths and just debunking them and being like, I believe you. Sometimes people just need to hear that a first time of like, I believe you. I took your case because I believe you 100%. And so that's not the question anymore for us. Now I just have to review all the information to see what we can do with your case and see how far I think I could get your case. It's not a matter of believing you. And so preparing them for what that process involves on our end of sort of screening and preparing the case. And then on the end of what's going to happen when lawyers on the other side start digging in and asking for information and asking questions. And, I keep going back to the trial that's going on in France right now because it's such a world example of what happens in these trials. But when they have put up horrible video and images of her during that trial, it's like a PTSD flashback of my own, of being in trials of my clients and seeing my clients' genitals put up on an overhead projector in a courtroom over my objection when it was really not required for the case.
Yeah.
And how just horrible, traumatic. I mean, just thinking of, if you had to think of that, of you being up in a courtroom in front of 40 strangers, it's a nightmare for any person, but especially someone who's been through sexual trauma. And so that she has been going through that, and she chose to do that publicly in this case, Gisele, to be a voice and to sort of unmask the shame of being a survivor in a country where that hasn't been done as much. It's an extremely brave act, but it is something that is sadly happening in courtrooms around the world and in the United States every day. Every day there's a Gisele somewhere else going through exactly what she's going through in different contexts, not always the same facts. And I think the scale of what was done to her for so long, involving so many people, is something that has made her case, really visible, and it should be. But I just can't, I think of other clients and being in courtrooms where they put up images and videos like that, and my clients having to sit there. And so, preparing
So
people
can
for that.
actually, I've been following this case for a long time, as you know, and there's a lot of difference because the laws are different. And I'm like, I was surprised that she wanted the video shown, because I was like, she fought for that. But then when I was reading the feminist journalists who are covering it and the reasoning behind it, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So and to go back to the perfect victim thing, she's literally a retired grandma, has like endless evidence, videos, photos, like meticulously, like I mean, the way he labeled these things is like, aggressive BJ, forced. I mean, he literally, it's like he's like admitting what's happening on the labels. And the way that they are literally doing to her what they would do to like the least perfect victim shows that it doesn't really matter who's up there.
Doesn't.
And the fact that, I think it was either today or yesterday, because again, I read up on it, not every day if I can't handle it that day, because it's really hard for me to cover this.
Yeah.
But it's really important to me too, because it's such an important case.
Yeah.
She finally left the courtroom, I think yesterday. She's been in there every day. And I don't know how her little heart is taking this, honestly. But she's got people there applauding her. All these women, especially, going down there and cheering her when she goes in, giving her flowers.
Yeah.
They had I actually wanted to go to it on Saturday, but I realized it was 4 hours for me to go to this, and I couldn't. I was too tired and just not in a good place. They had like a walk through the town where victims from all over went and did a quiet walk for all victims and to honor her. So she's got all this support from the world, and the reason why she wanted public A was for the shame to change sides, but B, she wanted everyone to see what they do to victims in that room. And also, when I thought about the videos, she doesn't, other than her lawyer, no one in that. She's got not just her husband who orchestrated all this. She's got 50 men and all of her abusers and their lawyers. She's got no one on her side, and she's got to sit there alone in that room with no support while they're showing those videos. And she was like, "No, if I have to watch this, y'all have to watch this. The media has to report on it. I want the media to know just how bad." Like the journalists are like people are having to leave the room because it's so hard for them to report on it. And she's snoring. She's literally snoring in these videos. So it's like she's just busted open the door and is like, I want everyone to see this because I don't want to be alone with this. And I understand her choice now to do that, even though.
And I'll say, I think
what you're saying before about having that, I could see how unnecessarily showing that would also be super disrespectful. So it was just interesting to hear both of those sides of that,
The videos they're showing in her trial, are they the videos of, not to be too graphic, but her unconscious during the acts?
Yeah.
I believe that's what they were. I I don't think they're allowing cameras in the courtroom in that trial, but their
No.
descriptions, like live
Yeah, like that's
tweets.
the journalists
Yeah.
they have drawings.
Yeah.
And the men all have their masks. Like they're not supposed to show. French law says you can't tell who the men being prosecuted. You can't give their name, but the names are out there. People are
Yeah.
like, nope, here's
Yeah.
the list. But there's no cameras in there, but there are journalists, and they're just reporting on it, live tweeting it, and that's who I follow. Is like literally, and the things these men are saying is so infuriating. And yesterday she finally left exasperated to collect herself because she hit a breaking point. And then she came back. She's going to show. I don't know how she's doing this. I don't know how she's doing this.
I mean, it is an inspiration, and I think the video and the fact that the videos have been shown and the fact that videos exist is something that when I was preparing for this, I was like, I think that's an important point because it doesn't exist in most rape cases.
Yeah.
And that
That's
is
again, she like is a perfect victim because of all the other things, and she has evidence of it, and they're still doing this to her. Like that's what I think would. I can see how you never have videos. I'm sure when you're representing people.
I have had some sadly cases with videos, and I tried a case that didn't have a video of the assault, but my client was incapacitated in a wheelchair, and a man who she was not with, who was not in her hotel room, pushed her completely. She was like a vegetable in a wheelchair. And she was heavily intoxicated and unable to even lift her head up. And there's video footage of him pushing her into his hotel room and the hotel staff helping him. And we got a $44.6 million verdict for that client.
Oh, was that the Hilton one?
That was the Hilton trial.
Okay.
And I'd love to pat myself on the back, but I mean, that video doesn't exist in most cases.
Yeah, exactly.
I have cases every day. I mean, they're all horrible, and all those clients deserve, like we've talked about, immeasurable damages for something that isn't going to just heal and disappear for them and is going to persist throughout their lives. But that case had video, and that case, the defendants, as they often do in these cases in their counsel, that was the case where the genitals of the client were put up in the open courtroom. I saw in the comments someone asked why in that case, and this is public, it was in a public trial, so I'm not sharing anything confidential. During the trial and through our experts, she had a sexual assault examination during her reporting to the police. And when you go fast enough, which I don't have in most of my cases, because most survivors, adult and children, don't report fast enough to even have those types of exams. But this client did, and she had the exam and she had genital injuries. We had an expert just describe those, which should have been enough. We did not put that evidence up on the projector. The defense put that evidence up on the projector. And I saw someone, and they had the ability to do it, and we couldn't really stop it. But I mean, someone said in the comments,
why would they do that? Why did they do that?
I mean, why do they do so many of these things that are not effective? I mean, that are really meant to shame, blame, belittle, cause other survivors not to want to go through this process. I mean, it was really not an effective tactic for them. And I was watching the jury as they started putting these photos up there, and I was just like, this is not going to be good for them. If this jury believes our client, which I believed the client fully, and was watching the jury and I felt like they believed the client, that they would punish them more because they did that. And I think we may see that and we do see that in other cases, and we've seen that in other sexual assault trials of there was an age, and there still is a lot of victim blaming and horrible behavior that goes on in these trials and in litigation, like our cases, where even just the questions that still get asked of, I always have to prepare child survivors of SA for consent questions, even though they were a child and they couldn't consent. But they're still going to be asked questions, even though they were a child, of like things they were wearing or things they did or other relationships they had. None of that changes the fact that they could not consent under our law at a certain age. depending
That
on the
doesn't make
state.
the lawyers look bad. Do they get? Do they? I mean, is it more common now because of the way people are understanding this, where the jurors might be like so disgusted by these defense
It
attorneys that they may.
depends. It depends
Mhm.
on where you are.
Mhm.
Geographically, it can depend on where
Yeah.
you are, the composition of your jury.
Mhm.
I do think that there is better understanding a little, but I mean, I was in a deposition yesterday, and I won't name the case. I have so many of these cases that it doesn't identify the client or the case, but it was a child sexual abuse survivor on a sports abuse case. And the lawyers were asking questions like, well, why didn't you tell your parents? I mean, I get they have to ask questions, that they have a job to do,
Mhm.
but their job is not one that involves having to blame a child victim. They can
Mhm.
just ask questions about facts and information without gaslighting and blaming someone who was a child.
Mhm.
And I just get incensed. I was telling you before we started this, I get an emotional hangover after those days, because it doesn't matter how many of these I do or how many of these clients I represent and walk through this process, that behavior is not required for their job. And I see it still from defense lawyers. And after the Hilton trial, I called it the pink high heels defense, because those lawyers literally brought up my client wearing pink high heels. Like, who freaking cares? I
Mhm.
mean, that she was wearing pink high heels or that she was wearing whatever. She was a vegetable in a wheelchair, and the hotel helped push her into the room of a man that was not her hotel room. And just because he said she's with me. And they bring up her pink high heels.
What
Uh,
can you think of? I mean, that's maybe the worst. Can you think of some of the examples of the worst things that some of these defense lawyers have done?
I
Um,
mean,
eh,
asking questions of children about consent when children can't consent.
mhm.
I repeatedly see questions about what victims are wearing, why they failed to report. I mean, the timing of reporting is questions. Those are questions that they have a right to ask. They're not
Yeah.
legally disallowed. But
Mhm.
just because something is legal and because it's a good idea to do it as a human or even as an advocate for their own clients are totally different things.
Mhm.
And so a lot of these, you know, defense lawyers, and I see it from law enforcement sometimes, of survivors who go in to report. I had a client who went in to report a sexual assault by a rideshare driver. And she's, you know, goes in, she reports it fairly quickly, like doing all the quote right victim things,
Mhm.
even though there's no right victim, but she's checking those boxes and it's
Yeah.
still not enough. And he asks her what she was wearing as one of the first questions. Like, why should that matter? She's allowed to take a ride share, even if she was in a short skirt. That is no invitation for anything, nor is it consent. And he asked her if maybe the driver thought she was a prostitute.
Oh my
And
God.
yeah. And you
I'm
know
like
what? That
I
client,
just had a visceral reaction to that. That makes
yeah.
me so angry.
Yeah, and that client was then completely chilled. She would not even talk to the police. That's how she ended up in my office. She
Mhm.
went to the police first, and that was their response. And she didn't want to participate anymore in the process
Yeah.
and was just completely chilled in going through the criminal process because that didn't feel safe and it wasn't for her. I've
Mhm.
dealt with some really, I would call them very woke prosecutors in the upper Northeast who are extremely trauma informed. And I've
Mhm.
dealt with some in Texas too, but there are some very rural areas in southern states where the views on women and
Yeah.
sexuality, those biases and myths and deep things that people may not consciously be like, I'm going to be an asshole to this victim, but there's a
Mhm.
seated cultural thing that's planted when they communicate with that victim when
Mhm.
they're a prosecutor in Southern Alabama. And so that's real. And
Yeah.
those biases invade and impact the way that they just communicate with a lot of my clients
Yeah.
and invade their decision making.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it can depend. There's some geography, sadly, in this, and
Mhm.
that shouldn't be the case for survivors.
Mhm.
I do a lot of work outside of Texas. We have a good percentage of cases in Texas, but I do a lot of work outside of Texas because sometimes I can make more of an impact in some of those states. I hope that I also make an impact in my home state because I think it's needed here, but it can be really hard in places where you're not just battling the actual violation that happened to your client. You're battling something so much bigger than that, with the beliefs of your judge, your prosecutor, your defense counsel, your jurors.
Yeah.
And you know, I think we're seeing some of that, and that's one of the really incredible things about what Gisele is doing in France. She is battling that and taking that on. I mean, just the very definition of consent now in France is being discussed and rethought because of what she's doing.
Although
And
I have a question about that, because that you, in your France 24 interview about the Weinstein case, you said it really brought up the intent and consent and those two topics. And that is one thing in this particular case. So I don't know how much you know about this, but I'm learning every day. France is very different. And so they approach, and I actually agree in theory and in general with this, rehabilitation versus just like lock up forever mentality. And that's why my understanding, if I get this wrong, but everything I've been learning is that if you rank one person or 300, it's 20 years, which I think is kind of crazy, because after 20 years, somebody who is like, there's literally a doctor who violated children, 300 and something children, and is facing 20 years. And to me, that's
France or I
Yeah.
didn't know the punishment range in France.
So they have, and I do actually, like, from my understanding, and again, there's so much I need to learn. It's like this idea of like that they can be rehabilitated and reformed and go back into the community. And so a lot of this case is really, really focusing on the backgrounds of all these poor men. Their daddy didn't love them. That's literally every day I'm just reading about, and it's a lot of traumatized men. But I had childhood essay and all these other things, and I didn't go do that. And so it's all this like, oh, my poor client, like he was just going to end up doing this, which is infuriating. And so this idea around, did they intend to do that? And of course, all the men, every single one of them accidentally raped her, even though, and that's why the videos are so important, because they literally have videos of her snoring while this is happening.
She is incapacitated.
She is totally
to me,
unconscious.
there's no way they didn't have intent based on the state she was in. Like,
and they're all saying that they thought it was a libertine thing, which is a whole nother cultural layer to this, because the libertine, swinging and all that stuff is a big thing here. But anybody who's a part of those communities knows that consent is the foundation of it. And like all those men know, even if they're in those communities, exactly what consent is. And so, but the arguments, but one of the arguments around changing the consent under French law, at first I was like, that sounds amazing. And then I heard some feminists push back against it, because they were saying all the things that could go wrong with that. And how it's going to put more burden on the victim and all this stuff. So I don't really know if I have enough to even explain what they're saying. But do you have, like, what are your thoughts around this intent, consent, and how that is like talked about in these cases?
I mean, I think about, I did some comparison as I was reading about Gisele's case and just what the laws in France and, consent and what is defined as sexual assault in the United States differs state by state. And so I pulled up, as I was just reading about it, comparisons of the 3 states that I'm licensed in, Texas, Montana, and New York. Consent is defined differently. Sexual assault is defined a little differently in each state. But each state does define consent in a way that it is part of sexual assault, that consent is required. Now, whether it is through words or actions, meaning it doesn't have to be affirmative consent, can differ based on the state. And affirmative consent is pretty progressive, and you don't often see that as spelled out in most state laws. I think actually weirdly Montana is a little ahead with that. I was kind of
Huh.
surprised.
Interesting.
In
Because
the
I
way
went to
that,
school. I went to college in Montana. I graduated in Montana. It's a very
I
red
mean, it is
state.
mostly, and then they have some weird, very like individual
Yeah.
personal liberty beliefs
Yeah.
at their core foundation because they're a Western frontier state.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, like, they have been on the abortion front, of
Yeah.
like enshrining it in their constitution. I'm like, go Montana.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, some of that, I don't like France's definition. I think
Mm-hmm.
sexual assault, that consent is a piece of that. And in Texas, it's pretty simply broken down of you don't have consent if someone's unconscious or incapacitated, and
Mm-hmm.
that's sexual assault. Or you don't have consent if you are coercing or forcibly threatening them.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that language is in the French definition. I think I wrote
Yes,
it down
I think
somewhere,
they're
but
trying to go for like surprise. I think is because it's
yeah.
surprise, violence, and I don't know. But the surprise thing was the thing where they were like, yeah, but if she's like not awake, that's a surprise.
Yeah. Yeah. So I can see, I mean, they're making their case and I think it fits within the definition, but I think the French attitude towards consent and like the cultural discussion
Mhm,
around it, even aside from the law, is a really important piece of what she's brought
mhm.
up, and making people think about and just talk about it is really important. And I think, you know, in France, it's interesting. I've been to France, but I have a lot of family that's from Switzerland. My grandparents are from Switzerland and the French speaking side.
Mhm.
And so just there are definitely some very misogynistic, very deep-seated cultural beliefs within that, like,
Mhm.
goes back centuries.
Mhm.
And she's starting to confront that at a very root level.
Mhm.
And I think defining consent and it being part of sexual assault definitions, I'd have to read some of the feminist pieces, but at least in the United States, a lot of feminists, I think, are in support of consent being part of
Yeah.
willing sex,
Yeah, like when I at first when I like my knee jerk reaction is like, well, of course, that's
Yeah.
always a good thing.
Yeah.
And I think I think what they're sounding the alarm on is that if they're going to do that, they got to be very careful how they do that because
They
if it's
do.
done
I do
wrong,
agree with that because I
you
have
know.
seen, we do some lobbying on state laws related to sexual assault. I've done some in Texas, and um, sometimes when legislators, both in states and different countries, go to make laws better, they muddy them
Yeah,
and they make
yeah,
them worse. That happens
yeah.
a lot in Texas. It is
Mhm.
just a train wreck in the Texas legislature. And so I see what they're saying on that front. You don't want to
Yeah.
make all these extra hoops,
Mhm.
for them to jump through, but you do want to make it clear that consent is, you should have consent or it is not a consensual sexual encounter.
Mhm.
Therefore, that is sexual assault at its like simplest level. And so, that's a tricky issue for a lot of people, but to me it
Yeah.
should be really simple.
Yeah, and it's funny. I doubt again because there's just this case is so big. I
Yeah.
literally could make. I probably will end up making at least 10 to 12 hours. I've already done I think
Yeah.
6 hours of videos. One of the things that I brought up in a video that I was like, it wasn't shocking because as you know, I'm sure a lot of the internalized misogyny in women makes a lot of times women actually end up behaving worse than men in certain positions of power. And one of the defense attorneys is a woman,
Mm.
and this stuff she is unhinged. Like she's worse than all of them. And then she went on social media. And I don't know if this would get you disbarred in the US, but like people were like, we need to change the laws around what lawyers can do. She went
Yeah.
on Instagram and made a video mocking Gisele, and it says, wake me up before you go. Played that song in a video mocking.
That's horrible.
And I'm like, how is she getting away with this? Like she's trolling the victim outside of the courtroom too.
Yeah, I think in the United States that would not be ethical for a lawyer. I don't know the
Right, like that
rules
you
for
could
the
get
bar in
disbarred for that, right?
France.
Like you like I
I
can't
don't think you could do that during the case. Now, after the case, you have if you're not, violating confidentiality and you're making some sort of statement as a person in the United States, you do have a lot of leeway, but you don't just have leeway to like harass a victim during a trial like that. I
yeah,
mean, during a trial, I go very quiet. We do
yeah,
need advocacy, and I believe that it is really important for survivors. But during the trial, I'm focused on the trial and I
yeah.
want the jury to hear, or the decision maker to hear the evidence, and
Mhm,
the media not be a part of it beyond reporting for the public to know. I think that's an
mhm.
important part. But you don't want to be sort of playing in that space during the trial. I don't think that's very professional.
Yeah, that's what a lot of the feminists I follow were like, okay, I think she's trying to be like a lawyer and a social media influencer because she's like
Yeah.
building a platform as this terrible.
Yeah.
But anyway, one of the things
That's
that's been
more,
brought up in this trial, I don't know if you saw how much of this case is that pretty much all of the men, their defense is, and it's so funny because Dominique is an old man. He's a grandpa, and their defense is he made me do it. They're all, I was afraid of him, and they were like, "Well, in the video, you don't seem afraid at all. You're actually instigating." No, no, no. I feared for my life. Like it. Do you?
they showed up. What were they showing up for?
I
Like,
would like, but that is literally their defense. Is would that fly in the U.S.? Someone saying that this man made me make her,
I
like would
mean,
that?
I don't doubt that people would try those sorts of comments and statements. I've seen all sorts of stuff from abusers and um, those who stand behind them. I don't think that's very effective. I think, one of the things that stood out to me about all the accusers that I think's been an important piece, just like the broader conversation about the trial, is that they have this sort of parade of all the abusers, and that they span all walks of life,
Hmm.
ages, types of men. Um, and it is debunking one of the rape myths I see a lot, which is rapists are a stranger in a dark alley.
Yeah, yeah.
And they are your neighbor, your family member, your priest, your coach, your
Yep.
boss. They span all roles and types of people, and it's not to say all those people are always abusers. There's not many,
Yeah,
many
yeah.
wonderful men and human beings out there, but that abusers are always going to be this strange monster in the alley. That's not the reality of most abuse.
And that's the
um
statistics.
yeah,
Statistics prove that. I mean, the most dangerous man
yeah,
in a woman's life is the woman in her bed and in her home. It's
yeah,
not the stranger.
no,
And and the funny thing is, just like in the U.S., they have the same. Well, they hide their racism behind the word immigrant, but
yeah,
we know exactly what there's. It's a
yeah,
dog whistle kind of thing.
yeah,
But basically, this trial has exposed like
mhm,
how much they will that most of the times it is these women's wives and husbands. You don't need to be worried about immigrants. That is literally a racist trope, and it
yeah,
is literally your dad because he was doing this to his grandkid, filming his daughter. So of
yeah,
course he's doing it to strangers with
yeah.
the cameras up the skirts.
Oh yeah, I had read
It
that
is
that's
literally the
how
men
they
in your
caught him.
life.
Yeah. No, I think that it's confronting that, predators and rapists are these strangers in a dark alley, and they're just these monsters that we don't know, but really they're among us.
Hmm.
And that's why, and it goes back, I think just because my own work and what I'm often focusing on every day is the institutions that have to, in that case it was a family situation, but in many cases where it's like the boss or the coach, and
Hmm.
people are witnessing interactions and they're seeing behaviors and they're just turning the other way.
Hmm.
And that's when institutions start facing accountability, and should,
Hmm.
when they prop someone up and allow them to keep doing it. And, I did read that there were like chat rooms and apps, I think, involved, which does pique my interest. And I just think about it because I do have some cases where, particularly, I represent minors who were
Hmm.
preyed upon on certain types of apps or social media pages. There was one in particular called Omegle in the United States.
What's it
Where
called?
Omegle, they've declared bankruptcy, but they matched people, and they were matching kids into these groups with adults that were predators. And then they would go off platform and communicate with them on something like Discord. And it was a way that predators could find children. And, these apps and these social media platforms that in the United States face a lot of protection under a federal law that protects the internet websites, and that law needs to be changed, because of how children are being preyed upon on these platforms. And I'm sure people have seen like the hearings in Congress in the United States with Facebook and TikTok and Twitter. And there have been all these now federal inquiries into these platforms of, why aren't you protecting kids? Well, they're not just protecting kids. Like, there are algorithms. They have data. They have the ability to monitor it. And in many contexts, at least for years, they were choosing not to. And so, and in fact, using that data to then create AI.
One of the other elements of this French trial is that the doctors are being called out again because missing critical thing. Like, they were like, he's literally taking, like, this man tried to first of all, they weren't even wearing protection, all those men. So she got, I think, 4 STDs, and he accused her of cheating. He was like, "Oh, you're cheating on me!" The audacity of this man. And he was taking her. She was having these huge memory losses, like days and times, and they literally were trying to get thinking she had Alzheimer's when it was literally she's just being drugged every day. And so some of the French doctors have been saying, wow, this is a moment of reckoning for us as well, because somebody who was paying attention should have connected these dots. And also, I didn't learn this until this case, that the majority of these date rape drug cases are husbands and partners. It's not the man. I'm not saying you shouldn't watch your drink at the bar, but they're literally putting it in our food. Like, that, they didn't surprise me, but something about it always associated the date rape drug with
a stranger,
a stranger, or guy you're going on a date with. There's not your husband. So
no, I think it does bring up just the connection to medical care and connecting those dots. Not that it's their fault, but they see the signs. And I think it seems like she had a lot of them that somebody should have picked up on. Chanel Miller says in her book, and I wrote it down because I wanted to say it: we fight to say you can't. We fight for accountability. We fight to establish precedent. We fight because we pray we'll be the last ones to feel this kind of pain. The clients are so motivated by preventing this for somebody else. And they have, I'm under no illusion that it is like a magic eraser and they're healed by reporting or going through the process. It is so hard, and it does cause more trauma. But I do see a lift and an empowerment, especially after a day like yesterday, where they got through 6 hours of questioning. They were in a hot seat. Every hard, embarrassing, heavy question was asked of them, and they got through it. And the strength that they feel in themselves of what they did, not just for themselves, but to fight for accountability, to establish better for the future for other people and themselves, is something that allows people to, I do think, move forward in their healing process. And I often see after the clients get through their deposition, I always tell them this. I'm like, you are getting through the hardest part for most clients. And when they get through it, there's like this light that, I don't know. It's like a light is shining for them. It's not that it's a race, but they're shining a light, and it is strengthening and it is empowering. And wherever that goes, when you shine that light out and you're like, we fight to say you can't. I love those words. I think that they're so important and empowering. And we fight to say you can't looks different for every survivor. And not every survivor needs to file a civil lawsuit or even can. Sometimes there's no one to pursue for that part of the case.
Yeah.
But when you take any step to report and seek your measure of justice, whatever that is, you are.
I love that. Your measure of justice.
Yeah, your measure of justice. You're seeking accountability for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it stops with you made the police report and they didn't do anything, you made the police report. Like you took steps, you were brave. And I think that it's a step that for a lot of survivors allows them to not move on, but to continue fighting and move forward. And I believe in the empowering part of reporting. And I also just really believe, even though we've talked about all the failures of law enforcement and the definite flaws in our criminal justice system, and I mean, it's broke. I've worked in it. I'm under no illusion that it's operating well in the United States, not at all. But I do believe that reporting is, as it relates to children, it's not a choice. It's the law here. But it is a part of trying to prevent it for other people. And that is usually, I get so many calls from survivors, especially when one of my clients files a lawsuit and then we start getting calls from other victims, which usually occurs.
Yeah.
They're not calling because a lot of them don't even really understand that they might have a civil claim.
Yeah.
Their literal words to me, and I've heard it so many times, are, I just want this other woman to know that she's not alone.
Yeah.
And that this happened to me too. And they're not like, I want to file my civil claim or will you represent me? Like that happens as part of the education process of me talking to them and seeing what they want to do and educating them on their legal rights. But most people who pick up the phone in those situations where they see another victim, like that's not even, and when you're in a conversation with someone, they're just trying to disclose, and there really a light has also come on for them of what it even was. Sounds kind of cheesy. I think Robin Roberts said it first, pain into purpose.
Yeah.
But it is so true. And I see them do that when they show up. And I've had clients write, and I've had clients set up support groups, and I've had clients enter leadership and survivor spaces. And have clients right now who are in law school who are survivors. Who are, doing things because of what they went through and the process, and frankly, wanting to be a voice for other people now. So
the hard lesson I've had with that though is I can take it too far, and I think I'm sure you've probably come up against this, and this is why it's really important for people, and people who've been following me for a while know this too, is sometimes, and actually my therapist here literally made me take a week off and stop because I was covering the Gisele case right after I'd had a man jerk off to me at the river, which happened literally the week that we were supposed to meet up. So I was such a bad place that I was like, oh, I'm so glad I'm not in that heightened fight or flight place when talking to you. And I talked about that story and put it on social media. It went viral, and all my stuff is shadow banned on TikTok. That's the one video that gets 1 million, and all of it is victim shaming, because it went out to a different part of the internet that normally watches my stuff. People who follow me would never say that stuff usually, or it was just, or they don't mean it that way. It was all, why were you at the river? Why were you in a swimsuit? Oh, literally just swimming at a public place in France. It was, and then the amount of men, because I looked at who was saving my video. Men, nasty men, saving my video to probably to my trauma talking about it. So disgusting that it made me physically ill.
Yeah.
And that's when my therapist was like, okay, Melanie, this is something that you need to consider, because especially being a survivor of incest and all that stuff, I am used to thinking of, I will do this for other people, but if you do that too much, then you are self-abandoning and you're putting yourself in harm's way.
No,
and so he was like, you're doing it for the sake of the story, and you're going to make yourself sick. Take a week off. You need to really rethink what you put out there, because you will pay a price as a storyteller. So, and I broke my number one rule. I talked about something before I'd recovered from it. I always say, as a storyteller, don't write about or talk about stories that you're in the middle of. You know, you're never going to recover entirely, but that I'm in the middle of the trauma of it. I can't talk about it because, so I need some time. And I broke my rule, and I literally was physically ill. I couldn't breathe. I had to have someone really help me breathe because I was in such a like, I had migraines. I was nauseous all the time, and it made me sick from just talking about the story on social media. And so the reason why I'm bringing that up is I also want, because a lot of we are conditioned as women to take care of everybody else, but not ourselves. And so that sense of purpose and doing it for others, it can be healing, but if you take it too far and don't also think about the impact it's going to have on you and always check in with yourself, and you abandon yourself to do that entirely, then we end up doing so much harm to ourselves. But that's that whole like, oh, for the sake of everybody else. It can be a good motivator, but used too much, it's self-destructive.
No,
So that's been
totally agree.
my journey is this
it's
middle
hard
place.
to find sometimes, and it is so individual for each person and their trauma and them as a person. And yesterday, I keep using the example of yesterday because yesterday was something very recent, but even as simple as like when clients go through those days, I'm not their counselor, but I talk through and I'm like, what are you going to do after the deposition? And the client's like, I'm going to have my husband pick me up with my dog, and we're going to go eat this favorite food of mine. And I'm like, good. Like, you've got to plan things that are healing and little joys, and pace yourself in helping and healing, and having that be a purpose and trying to help other people with what you've been through. There has to be some pace to it, and that's different for every person. And I think people navigating that, you really need to navigate it with a counselor or therapist, because
Because
they can
literally
help you talk through
he
what
gave
that
me
is.
such a lecture. He was like, but because he knows my story, he knows me well, and he understands the survivor mindset where like literally when this happens in the family too, you literally love the person who is your predator. And so your instinct is to protect them, and that your body isn't your own, your life isn't your own, everything is in their hands. And I can be that way as a storyteller and journalist. Like, oh, who cares what it does to me? I'm doing it for the sake of the story because the story's going to help people. And so that was a big lesson for me. And he was like, you're the kind of person that we see in cancer wards at the end of their life, and their body was telling them enough, and you didn't listen. It's talking to you right now.
No, that brings
You know what I
up,
mean?
the body, if you've ever heard of the book, The Body Keeps the Score,
Yeah.
the toll. And, I think there will be more science. Sadly, there's just not as much science on the study of even women's reproductive health as there should be. But the impact for so many of my clients, and just the threads that I'm seeing through my own cases of impact on fertility, impact on sexual wellness, impact in so many areas, that even though the medical profession, there are some studies, but not every doctor you go to is going to like make that connection between your sexual abuse and your endometriosis spreading.
And all these autoimmune diseases and stuff.
And all these autoimmune diseases and chronic pain and literal pelvic pain when you've been through sexual trauma makes a lot of sense. And you go to, and a lot of my clients go to doctors, and there's all this unexplained, these dots that haven't been medically connected, that I see now as patterns after years of this work, that I'm like, I know what this is from. Like, and I wish science would definitively connect it all for me better. We're working on that. And I think in hopefully my career and lifetime, we'll see more in the area of studying women's actual health and bodies, which I think is an area that has been lacking. We all know
if you
that.
just look at the menopause,
and like
I'm
big
like, what?
pharma, like how they've just focused on like even just using like controls as not women but just men. We're just gonna test this drug on a man. And just what we have seen a lack of, and menopause care and women's health care and reproductive care, and that's all, it's all connected. And so I hope we see more advances in that area, because I think we'll see advances in connecting the dots for the impact, particularly of sexual trauma or any trauma, on our physical health and well-being. and that it's not in our head. It's not in their head. If you feel like your body is being impacted by something and you're having symptoms, it's often a signal to pull back or adjust.
Yeah.
And I love that you're open about so many things. I think it's so important and refreshing, and it does help other people, but you can't help other people if you're not well.
Yeah. If I die like
Yeah.
20 years early because I
No.
had to, for the sake of the story, then
Yeah.
what use am I?